The old saying, elections have consequences, is playing out in very real time in a very real way in cities all across our country as the Trump administration makes good on one of Trump's most controversial campaign promises, a promise that was immortalized in that sea of signs at the Republican National Convention. Mass deportations now. 1 week into Trump's second term, it's no longer an abstract idea or controversial campaign promise or even a convention sign. The deportations are underway. Over the weekend, we saw them in cities like Chicago, a city Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, has repeatedly taunted, calling Chicago ground zero for mass deportations. In all, ICE made 956 arrests on Sunday in Chicago and around the country, quote, the largest single-day number to date by the Trump administration, and at least 2,681 arrests since his inauguration last Monday. Those numbers may or may not tell the whole story. It is an open question how Trump's mass deportations will ultimately stack up against previous administrations. But one thing that is not an open question, one thing we don't have to wonder about, is how it feels if you are undocumented in America right now, or even if you worry that you could be mistaken for being undocumented because of the color of your skin or your name. This is a headline out of Chicago. Quote, "We are terrified." The New York Times spoke with one man, a man who was born in this country, who said this, quote, "I can tell you that even for those of us who are citizens or have a green card, there's fear. I'm scared myself, not that I'll be deported because I was born here, but I'm scared that I may get scooped up in a mass arrest." That fear of mass arrest and disorientation and uncertainty is not an unintended consequence or a design flaw of Trump's mass deportations. It is the design feature. It is exactly what the Trump administration intends. And you don't have to take our word for it, because, as usual, the Trump administration is saying the quiet part out loud. Here's Vice President J.D. Vance.
We empowered law enforcement to enforce the law everywhere to protect Americans.
Effect, a chilling effect, arguably, to people to not send their kids to school.
I desperately hope it has a chilling effect on illegal immigrants coming into our country.
I desperately hope it has a chilling effect. There you have it. The cruelty, the intended fear, the intended confusion, the intended chaos is the point. It's their objective. It's also where we start today with NBC News national correspondent and executive producer of the documentary film Separated, Jacob Soboroff. Jacob, first tell me what's going on all across the country. Start with Chicago.
I think, Nicole, what we see is what we see. The facts on the ground are the facts on the ground. They are carrying out deportation efforts, immigration enforcement operations, to use the specific terminology that the Department of Homeland Security uses. But whether or not what we're witnessing is the largest mass deportation in American history is still, if not up for debate, a story that is yet to be written. There is a major show of force going on across the country, started by the Trump administration, to create the perception that immigration enforcement is out in the streets all across the United States of America. And I think that it's important to note that that is indeed happening. And there are people being deported, likely as you and I are speaking right now, back to their home countries. I think it's also important to underline that what we have seen play out in Chicago and Atlanta and in Phoenix and in Denver and in Los Angeles and in cities throughout Texas over the course of this weekend are also enforcement operations that have played out historically in the United States of America, both under President Trump's predecessor, Joe Biden, and President Trump's predecessor in his first term, President Obama, who deported more people than any president in the history of the United States of America. There are certainly differences that we have seen played out, including the mobilization of the U.S. armed forces, like the military, the Marines, for instance, we've seen down on the southwest border. But they are playing limited enforcement roles in these circumstances. And in the interior, though, you have seen agencies like DEA join forces with other Homeland Security agencies like HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, and ICE and ATF participate in this type of enforcement action. As you said, there is certainly an effect that's happening here, that people are aware of this, that they're cognizant of it. But what's sort of the larger story is here is, as I said, and I think it's important to understand and for people to remain cognizant of, it has yet to be written, and these are unfolding on sort of a day-by-day, almost hour-by-hour basis now.
So I want to press and try to deepen my own understanding of what's different other than the production of it. I want to share some reporting about quotas. This is from the Washington Post. ICE officials have been directed by Trump officials to aggressively ramp up the number of people they arrest from a few hundred per day to at least 1,200 to 1,500 because the president has been disappointed with the results of his mass deportation campaign so far. That's according to 4 people with knowledge of the briefings. Senior ICE officials were told that each of the agency's field offices should make 75 arrests per day, and managers will be held accountable for missing those targets. So, I mean, quotas do make it more likely that the thing that people who are here legally, who spoke in that reporting I read from, could get swept up. If you're trying to hit a target in any quota in law enforcement, speeding, anything, you can make mistakes. And I wonder, the reporting is out there that the numbers didn't even match the numbers under the final Biden numbers. And so I wonder if you can just tell me the role that the statistics and the numbers are playing in the policy and a policy of quotas that seems to increase the odds of mistakes being made.
Well, you know, I don't want to use too strong of language here, but whether or not they're obsessed with the numbers, they have made very clear they want the largest deportation effort in American history. Mass deportation now was what the sign said on the floor of the Republican National Convention. It was an official part of the party platform, a part of the Trump campaign, and they're certainly working hard to create the appearance of that. And like you said, in many respects, this is a production. Dr. Phil was out last night live with Tom Homan, who, when the borders are for President Trump, when he was confronted by our colleague Gabe Gutierrez about whether or not there are actually quotas, he denied that there were. But the numbers have certainly gone up from the day-to-day numbers of the outgoing administration. But whether or not, and I think this is really important for people to understand, whether or not these numbers that they have made a feature of their Instagram posts and their social media, Twitter posts and stuff, whether or not those numbers stay consistent at this level is a function of how many quote-unquote criminals they're going to go after. And if violent criminals, people who pose a threat to society, are their priority, what happens beyond those numbers? Because certainly if you're going to run the largest mass deportation effort in American history, you're going to be picking up people who are everyday civilians in the United States of America who, while they might happen to be undocumented, are also teachers, workers, neighbors, friends, people who are at your church. And that's, I think, part of this story as well, that they have removed the sensitive locations guidance from the Department of Homeland Security. So now undocumented immigrants, and Tom Homan confirmed this to Gabe Gutierrez, could very well be picked up at a school or a church or another location. He says it's a matter of national security, but you don't stage the largest deportation effort in American history without undocumented migrants who don't have criminal histories.
Jacob Soboroff, we're going to need you. Please stay free at 4 o'clock Eastern. Thank you for your reporting on this. And of course, the Trump administration says this is just the beginning, the opening salvo, if you will. They've indicated that one of the next towns that could be targeted could be Aurora, Colorado, where over the weekend, quote, hundreds of community members gathered in the snowy cold Saturday at Fletcher Plaza to protest Donald Trump's threat of mass deportations, a rally that drew as many as 700 immigrants, activists, and allies. Joining our coverage is Democratic Congressman Jason Crow, who represents Aurora, Colorado. First, what are you hearing from your constituents?
Well, Nicole, I represent one of the most diverse communities in the country, right? And I just want to paint a picture for you. This is a community where nearly 20% of my constituents were born outside of the United States. I have 130 languages spoken in my public school system, right? And these folks are business owners. They go to school with my kids. They work in our businesses. They are so much a part of the lifeblood and the strength and the vibrancy of our community, and they are afraid, which is why I'm standing up and I'm being very clear about what we're going to tolerate and what we won't. You know, and I think this is important for every American right now, to be really clear about what it is we're dealing with. I haven't heard or talked to anybody who says we shouldn't deport and detain violent criminals, that we shouldn't clean up our streets and keep communities, keep our children safe. Everybody agrees on that, and it's already a crime. What we're talking about is a mass deportation that's rounding up everybody, children, families, business owners. And I would like somebody in the Trump administration to explain to me how doing that is actually going to reduce costs, help our businesses, help our communities, and make us more safe. Because doing that will do the exact opposite, and they know it.
So what is a list of what you will tolerate and will not for your district?
Well, I'm not going to tolerate mass deportation efforts of children and families and people who are striving to start a life here, who want to normalize their status within the United States. We owe those folks comprehensive immigration reform because that's in our best interest of our economy. Right? I spend a lot of time with small business owners. You know, Colorado is a small business state. Aurora is a small business state. 85% of our workers and our businesses are small businesses in my community. Right? And those folks, when I go and visit them, they say their number one problem is workforce. They want to grow their businesses. They can't find enough workforce. So we owe comprehensive immigration reform. That's visas, that's DACA programs, that's providing a pathway to citizenship who are here, who own homes, who are already paying taxes to normalize their status because that's what they want to do. And that's what's in the best interest of our economy. What I won't tolerate, and what nobody should, is violent criminals, right? Yes, go after violent criminals. It's already against the law. And guess what? We had a bipartisan reform effort in Congress last year that was heavily negotiated between Republicans and Democrats that would have provided more enforcement, would have provided more border security, would have provided pathways to citizenship. Donald Trump blew it up because he'd rather run a campaign on the problem than try to solve the problem. So let's go back to that and actually talk real solutions and come together to solve this issue instead of doing what they're doing and trying to distract America with mass deportations, while at the same time, their billionaires and the cronies and the top 1% are slowly turning our government into a piggy bank for their own pockets.
So let me begin with a classic quiz show. It was called What's My Line, and it aired on CBS during the late 1950s and early 1960s. Now, the gimmick for the show was for a celebrity panel to try to guess the profession of a mystery guest. The panel for the January 1964 episode included actress Arlene Francis, comedian Steve Allen, columnist Dorothy Kilgallen, known as the voice of Broadway, and Bennett Cerf, the co-founder of Random House Publishing. The host, journalist John Charles Daly, was previously best known as the first national correspondent to report on the Pearl Harbor attack and the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt. The first mystery guest signed in as Jerry Whittington from West River, Maryland.
Is it Miss or Mrs. Whittington?
It's Miss.
Miss Whittington. Where are you from?
West River, Maryland.
West River, Maryland.
Yes.
That's nice to have you with us. Miss Whittington, may I present our panel? Now, would you join me over here, please? And we'll let the audience in the theater and the audience at home know exactly what your line is.
So it turns out President Lyndon Johnson had arranged for Ms. Whittington to appear on the show rather than announce her hiring via press conference. He knew that the hire would be controversial. Geraldine Jerry Whittington was the first black woman to work in a non-domestic job in the White House. She got hired as LBJ's personal secretary when, after the assassination of President Kennedy, the new president wanted a fresh pool of secretaries in the White House. He reportedly saw Ms. Whittington working in another government office and asked his aide, Jack Valenti, to track down her number. Here's part of the phone call recorded by Johnson of him calling Ms. Whittington to offer her the job.
This is Whittington.
Just a minute. You?
Hello?
Where are you?
I'm at home. Who's this?
This is the president.
Oh.
What are you doing?
Oh, I think someone's playing with me.
No, you know, I won't talk to you about our work, honey. Where are You at home?
Oh, yes, I am.
Are you busy?
No, I'm not.
Can you come down here immediately?
Oh, I'll be glad to.
Come down. I've got Jack Valenti here, and we want to talk to you about a little reassignment.
Okay, I love that at first she did not believe that it was the president calling. According to his biographers, Johnson specifically wanted to hire a black woman as his personal secretary to send a message to the racist segregationists in his Southern Democratic Party. Hiring her was a nod to diversity, inclusion, and economic opportunity. At the time Ms. Whittington was hired, this is what Johnson's cabinet looked like. Note the many varieties of white guy. That's also what most of the federal workforce looked like, particularly after a previous Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson, formally segregated the civil service in 1913. Wilson and his cabinet exiled black postal workers to the dead letter office, where they couldn't be seen by the public. They created segregated workspaces and even required federal job applicants to affix a photo of themselves to their applications to make it easier to discriminate. Fast forward to LBJ, who after Kennedy's assassination was under pressure from Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement, was pushing Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and a 1968 law to open up immigration to people from non-white countries. Jerry Whittington was a message. She was also the first person Johnson told that he was nominating Thurgood Marshall to be the first black Supreme Court justice. She and Justice Marshall happened to have died on the same day in 1993. But here she is, featured inside Jet magazine. But LBJ wasn't done.
You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bringing up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. Thus, it is not enough just to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates. And this is the next and the more profound stage of the battle for civil rights. We seek not just freedom, but opportunity. We seek not just legal equity, but human ability. Not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result.
That was Lyndon Johnson announcing during a June 1965 commencement address at Howard University his plan to take direct aim at economic inequality. In September of that year, he signed Executive Order 11246, which barred discriminatory hiring practices by federal agencies, federal contractors, or subcontractors. And even after it was narrowed to include just the contractors and subcontractors, the order literally changed the federal workforce, as subsequent presidents, Republican and Democrat, continued to enforce it, Bill Clinton in particular. Today, about 19% of federal workers are black in a country that's about 11% black, and about 60% of the federal workforce is white in a population that's about 59% white. Desegregating federal employment literally built the black middle class in states like Virginia, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. Black postal workers became a bedrock of the black middle class nationwide. There have been thousands and thousands of Jerry Whittingtons, which is probably why the civil service is a prime target of the right-wing Heritage Foundation, its Project 2025 playbook, and almost obsessively anti-black figures like Stephen Miller, who seems in many ways to be running the Trump government. If obnoxious performative proclamations like ending the commemoration of Black History Month and MLK Day in federal agencies and no longer teaching about the Tuskegee Airmen in the Naval Academy, which they retracted, are any indication. But if you look deeper into what this second Trump administration is doing, not just the provocative stuff that they're saying, it sure seems like something else is going on. I think to understand it, you first have to realize that federal contracting is the single biggest source of wealth in America. It's a nearly $1 trillion pot of tax money each year spent with private companies. Getting federal contracts is literally how companies and their founders and CEOs become super rich. Think SpaceX, owned by Elon Musk, and Blue Origin, owned by Jeff Bezos, or United Healthcare. All are among the biggest federal contractors in the U.S., though nothing is bigger and eats up more of our tax money than defense contractors. And with Tom Homan and Stephen Miller's twisted kick in the schoolhouse, restaurant, and church doors and drag undocumented people into military planes after demanding their papers, apartheid South Africa-style plan well underway in blue cities like Chicago, Illinois, and Newark, New Jersey, private prison stocks are soaring. They're posed to see a boom in federal contracts with the Trump regime. And Bezos and Elon and Mark Zuckerberg and Peter Thiel and the rest of the tech oligarch bros and Bitcoin bros are surely preparing to belly up to the Trump teat to suck out even more federal contracts, which explains why Elon and fellow tech bro Sam Altman are currently catfighting over the new AI regulations the Trump cacistocracy are cobbling together with executive orders that some eagle-eyed legal journalists have spotted seem to have been written with AI chatbots. The money that's about to flow to Trump's friends and cronies is likely going to make your head spin, all funded by you, the taxpayer. On top of you having to fund the gargantuan additional tax cut Republicans are prepping so the super rich can pay as close to zero in taxes as possible. Not to mention you footing the bill on those 25% tariffs on your Colombian coffee and anything that's imported from Mexico, Canada, and Panama. Oh, yeah, and just wait till Trump launches his Putin-style military assault on Greenland and Panama. Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and the other defense behemoths are going to bathe in contractor cash, which is really super profitable. You know, war is like the most profitable thing. So while you're focused on the terror raids and the firings and the End Black History Month and the fake piety about merit while Trump hires literal TV personalities to run his government, Trump and friends are preparing to pull off what amounts to a giant bank robbery. Guys, they're going to loot the federal government, hand out contracts to their friends who no longer have to worry about hiring black folks, women, disabled veterans, LGBTQ folks, anybody who might not go along with the scam. Because when you're preparing to start the steal, you know what you don't need hanging around? Witnesses. Like, say, longtime civil servants who make the government run, whether the president is someone they voted for or not. You don't want civil servant witnesses around when you start the steal, because they might tell. You know who won't tell? Cronies, who got their jobs only because they pledged total personal loyalty to the felon in chief.
Susan, by the way, this move from the White House to fire these inspector generals, despite a 2022 law that requires Congress to be given 30 days notice from the administration, what exactly does that tell you?
It says that Donald Trump does not want his administration to be held accountable for anything. He believes, wrongly in my opinion, that he has a mandate to go into government and do whatever he sees as fit. That is not the case. However, it's also worth noting he believes he also has immunity. So while he made immunity, I should say, from the Supreme Court in any actions that come out of his his presidential orders. So by firing these IGs, excuse me, he is in fact saying, like, I don't care what the law is, I'm immune, and I don't want people who may be calling out mistakes that happen in agencies, which is ironic because inspector generals, what they do is find fraud, waste, and abuse that tend to save the taxpayers money.
Julie, what's the reaction on Capitol Hill to this?
Well, it's certainly mixed. You have Republicans trying to walk the fine line of not criticizing Trump in his first week in office, but this is not a move that is going to be respected or accepted well by Republicans and Democrats alike up here. Of course, they're all coming back to town on the Senate side, at least. Later today, we'll get a chance to ask them directly. But for example, Chuck Grassley, who for as long as I've covered him under the Trump administration, under the Biden administration, has sought to bolster protections for inspectors general, has sought to keep his relationship with whistleblowers in a good place. He already put out a statement over the weekend saying that he would like more information, a quote, further explanation from President Trump, because Trump did violate a law that Grassley and Democrats and Republicans alike have signed several years ago. It requires a 30-day notification at least from the administration to Congress when they were to, if they were to fire any of these inspectors generals. That didn't happen in this case. That's exactly what Kristen Welker pressed Senator Lindsey Graham on. Watch this.
I'm not overly worried about that. It's not the first time people have come in and put their team in place. When you win an election, you need people in your administration that reflect your views. So I'm not really worried about that.
But very quickly, the law says he's supposed to give you 30 days notice. He didn't do that. Do you think he violated the law?
Well, technically, yeah, but he has the authority to do it. So I'm not, losing a whole lot of sleep that he wants to change the personnel out.
Technically, yes. I think that was such a revealing ad, that word there. Technically, I think it certainly means that Republicans are probably not going to do much when it comes to this. Again, they control the House and the Senate, so it's really on them to do anything here.
Yeah, Basil, I mean, the now former Inspector General of the Small Business Administration spoke with my colleague Ana Cabrera. Here's how he reacted to the firings.
If it's about changing priorities in the administration and non-adherence to the rationale that we're not a part of the administration and you're going to put people in who are more like loyalists, then the whole system is in shambles.
Basil, that gentleman did go on to say that the president has the right to do this. Where is that right to do things and not do things, and on something so sensitive as this issue?
Well, I think that's why Lindsey Graham's point, is something that we really should be reflecting on going forward, because while the president does have the right to put his own appointees in place, he can do so in accordance with the law. That's why the technically yes comment is so striking, because it suggests that while the president would need, and we would expect the president to follow the law, he's going to do whatever he wants to do whenever he wants to do it. And, to Julie's point earlier and Susan's point, making sure that Republicans are in line with this is critically important, because in the House, they have the smallest majority. The Republicans have the thinnest majority. The second thinnest majority they've ever had in history. There's obviously a thin majority in the Senate. You see Mitch McConnell's comments against Hegseth the other day, which was, not necessarily a profile in courage, because he really doesn't have much to lose at this point. But it does suggest that there might be a lot of members who are uncomfortable with his moves. So he brings them tomorrow to Florida to get them comfortable with the things that he needs to do going forward. So the technically yes, but we'll do it anyway, I think is going to be a recurring theme in the next 4 years.
And Julie, meanwhile, speaking of Hegseth, the new defense secretary, arrived at the Department of Defense and spoke to reporters. Listen to what somebody had to say.
It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to serve on behalf of the president and serve on behalf of the country. It's an amazing job, beyond what anyone can fathom. But in talking to the chairman and so many other folks here, we're in capable hands. The warfighters are ready to go.
And Julie, I mean, this came only after the vice president broke the tie to get him confirmed. What's ahead for the president's other nominees this week?
And that was such a rare moment, by the way, a tie-breaking vote needed on any nominee, let alone somebody to lead the Pentagon Department. But over the weekend, in addition to Hegseth, you saw Kristi Noem, who is Trump's Homeland Security Secretary, be confirmed by the Senate. Over the weekend is critical here, because I think you're going to see that happening over the next weeks. Congress needing to stay in to push Trump's agenda over the finish line, nominees or otherwise. And then later this week, Sean Duffy, who's going to be Trump's Department of Transportation Secretary. We expect the Senate to confirm him. And then that gets us into some of the more controversial names that we've been hearing about that have yet to have a hearing before the relevant committees of jurisdiction. I'm talking about somebody like Tulsi Gabbard, who is going to be Trump's National Intelligence Director if she is confirmed. That's a big if, because she does have bipartisan opposition. There are Republicans concerned about her. There are Democrats concerned about her. Even Lindsey Graham yesterday with Kristen Welker was a hard maybe. The question is, do Republicans then follow suit anyway, like we saw happen with Pete Hegseth and some of the more reluctant Republicans, Tom Tillis and others, coming around and ultimately pushing them through. I think a similar picture is going to happen with RFK Jr., his hearing the same day as Tulsi Gabbard's hearing. It's going to be a busy one. Again, Republicans certainly pushing back against him. The former Vice President Mike Pence is no fan of RFK's policies, specifically when it comes to his views on abortion. Democrats, he might pick up votes on that side of the aisle in terms of his food policies, stuff that he wants to do in that space. So a lot of interesting hearings that are coming this week. We'll see if Republicans do shore up the votes to get him across the finish line. I think if Hegseth was any reflection of that, they probably will. Jose.
And so, Susan and Basil, and let me ask you first, Basil, Gabbard, RFK Jr., Patel, who do you see as the most vulnerable?
You know, in some ways, I actually see Tulsi Gabbard as the most vulnerable. Republicans that she met with expressed real concern about her comments with respect to Edward Snowden. And this is one of those areas where, because of her comments, because of her relationships, you can draw a line between, or at least her opponents will draw a line between, you know, her positions and challenges and dangers for the United States. That seems to be the most controversial to me.
And Susan?
I would also agree with Basil in saying that it's Tulsi Gabbard only because it comes down to national security. But I also think JFK Jr. is certainly in the running to be knocked out of this nomination. I'm sorry, RFK Jr. Apologies.
To be with you, I'm Katie Tur. Welcome to the F around and find out presidency. No, seriously, that is how Donald Trump is billing it, posting this AI-generated image of himself as a gangster in a fedora with FAFO on the sign next to him. F around and find out. So what does that mean? For those of you who are not terminally online, it essentially means President Trump is telling the world and lawmakers here at home, try me. Colombia got it over the weekend when the president announced a 25% tariff and visa restrictions on Bogota when leaders there refused a U.S. military plane full of deported immigrants. Colombian President Gustavo Petro quickly backed down, notching a win for Donald Trump. So is that how this is going to go? Trump makes a decree, an official or a country scoffs, Trump levies a giant tariff or a travel ban, and then they just back down? Will that work with China? What about Mexico or Canada? And if it doesn't, what happens then? How much actual economic pain could come from these policies? And is President Trump willing to inflict it? Joining us now, NBC News senior business correspondent Christine Romans, chief White House correspondent for The New York Times, and MSNBC political analyst Peter Baker, and the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Michael Froman. He served as the U.S. trade representative in the Obama administration. Christine, I'm going to start with you on this. It was a quick back and forth between Colombia and President Trump over the weekend, and you know, it worked in Donald Trump's favor. Is this what we should expect for Mexico and Canada going forward? The Wall Street Journal is reporting that he's already talking about a 25% tariff on those two countries.
Yeah, he has called himself tariff man. He is not all bark. He is all bite, and he will impose tariffs on these countries. And a lot of people think it's going to happen, at least for Canada and Mexico, come Saturday, that this is going to happen quickly. He doesn't even have his trade team in place yet. I mean, you know, confirmed, the Commerce Secretary and his U.S. trade representative. And so he is adamant that this is the tool he has. He is going to use it. He's been saying it for a year. I think there's no reason to think that he won't do it. You know, the discussion has been, will it be, is this only, you know, as a tool to get people to the negotiating table? And all the signs right now point to there's no negotiating table. There'll be tariffs, and then we'll see what happens after that.
Okay, so if these tariffs were levied, if Colombia, say, didn't back down and there was a 25 scaling up to 50% tariff on Colombia, their big imports or exports for us are coffee and bananas. What would that look like at the grocery store?
It would be higher coffee and higher banana prices and higher rose prices. They also export an awful lot of flowers. Let me give you an example. Washing machines. In the first Trump administration, President Trump put import tariffs on washing machines. The University of Chicago and the Fed found those tariffs raised prices on all washing machines by $92 each and brought in only $82 million in tariff money while increasing costs for the companies by a lot. So he's done this before. The question is, if he does it again, then does that cause those companies like Samsung and LG to move their factories to the United States? That's what he wants.
Christine mentioned a negotiating table. You know, he's going to go to the extreme end of the bargain in order to get a better deal. And that's kind of been the modus operandi that we've experienced with Donald Trump over the years, certainly during the first administration. Peter, though, Christine was saying there's no negotiating table this time. It's this or else, you know, F around and find out. I'm going to be very careful when I say that so I don't say the whole phrase because it will get me fired. But do you sense a different Donald Trump this time, a different Donald Trump administration, a bigger willingness to actually do the extreme things that he's saying he'll do?
Well, I think you see a president who is more willing to use the instruments of American power than his modern-day president's predecessors have been. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is it has been effective. We have seen even just in the last week, even before he became inaugurated, he used threats in order to achieve policy goals. The lesson he has taken from, threatening all hell will break out in the Middle East is it worked in terms of motivating the parties there to have a ceasefire in Gaza. The lesson he takes from threatening sanctions or threatening tariffs, on Canada is that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will rush to Mar-a-Lago and pledge to do whatever Donald Trump wants, in effect. I mean, he's not saying that, but he is definitely deferring to Trump's needs and desires in a way that other prime ministers might not have done with other presidents. So from his point of view, it's working. Now, that doesn't mean there's not long-term consequences. Not much of a negotiation. It's not really very subtle. And you're using it against people in countries that are typically our friends that we may need in other circumstances. At the same time, he's bashing the European Union. The European Union may be really important to us if we end up in a trade war with China. So it has costs if you use this kind of technique in a more expansive way. But for the moment, Trump is trying to tell the world, do what I say, and everything will be fine.
Yeah, elaborate on that. Elaborate on the ways in which we might need typically our friends here. Why would we need Colombia for in another situation? You mentioned the EU needing them in a trade war if that happens against China. What else should we be concerned about?
Well, all kinds of things. We use our friends for intelligence sharing. They help us suss out threats to us around the world. We use our friends often for, military operations if we feel that we need to in certain sectors of the world. We use them for diplomacy when we need to put pressure on mutual adversaries to do important things. Colombia has been one of our better friends, and it's partly because of the friendship we've had with Colombia that we have minimized, some of the drug toll that we saw, in decades past because we collaborated with them in going after the cartels. So there are, benefits to friendships, not just transactional relationships in which we threaten to use, economic force if they don't give us what we want.
But at the same time, Donald Trump is saying that the people that he's sending back are criminals. They're people that don't need to be in this country, shouldn't be in this country. So is there a cost if we are forcing countries to take back people who came here without the proper documentation, then committed crimes here? Peter.
Well, in the case of Colombia, it was a dispute over what kind of airplanes we were using to send them back. It wasn't even over sending back the migrants. They've taken back hundreds of planes of migrants long before Trump came in office. But what they objected to was using the U.S. military planes to do so. And rather than simply, having a quick conversation and figuring out a way around it, Trump quickly went up the escalatory ladder and made it out to be an all-out kind of confrontation. Now, that may be what he wants and may be the signal he's trying to send to other countries, that he's willing to escalate where previous presidents might not have, or even small disputes. And therefore, I think it creates an atmosphere in which other countries, he hopes, will preemptively defer and preemptively, cater to what they believe to be his wishes, even without him having to ask.
And there is intention behind sending a military flight rather than a commercial flight. What message that sends? Mike, I want to get to you with the big question, which is, does this sort of thing work with China?
Well, first of all, I think it just shows how attractive the U.S. market is as an incentive for other countries to work with us, and how the threat of closing our market to their exports has a great deal of leverage. As Peter says, it works. It got people's attention. In this case, it was relatively easy because it was a very specific issue, taking these military planes, and so it could be resolved quite quickly. I think the problem or the question around China and maybe some of the other countries is it's a much more complex relationship. And so what is it we're asking these other countries to do? How will we know that they've done them? How long will it take? And there, if you actually go and impose the tariffs, it has a whole series of costs. The direct cost of imposing the tariffs, the cost of retaliation, the cost of other countries imitating our behavior, and then very importantly, longer term, it really opens the door to China. Because for years, we've been critical of China for using its economic power as a coercive tool. We see them do this. We've seen them do this against Japan, against Korea, against Australia. And frankly, China doing that helped those countries develop closer relationships with us. The same thing can happen in reverse. If the U.S. is now seen as engaging in the same type of economic coercion that China has, we could be opening the door for more Chinese influence, where those in Colombia or elsewhere would argue, what's the difference between the U.S. and China? They're both using their economic power against us.
Are our markets more attractive, though, than China? Is there a situation where Donald Trump does have better leverage in making these, forcing Colombia or other countries to do what he wants them to do? In this case, it's taking back people who are here without papers, sending back, immigrants. In other cases, it could be wanting a better trade deal, or it could be wanting a country to pay more into NATO. There's other situations. Are our markets so attractive that Donald Trump does actually find himself in the catbird position?
Well, I think we do have a fair amount of leverage, and particularly over some countries more than others. Mexico, Canada, very much dependent on the U.S. economy. But most of the world is highly dependent on China. China is their number one trading partner, and so we just have to keep that in mind. I think the question will be: take Mexico for example. Tariffs are expected to go into place as early as February 1st, 25% tariffs. He's talked about dealing with migration issues and fentanyl. That's not something that can be decided or resolved over a weekend like the Colombia military plane issue was resolved. And so will the tariffs go into place? How long will they last? How will we know what the negotiation looks like and when it's reached successful implementation? And what's the damage done in the meantime? It's weighing those trade-offs that I think is very much at issue. And oftentimes we seem to take economic policy steps like threatening or imposing tariffs without sufficient concern about what the short, medium, and long-term costs of trade-offs are going to be.